name is Mr. Brain. I want to learn what happens to me when I read.
Don't worry, Mr. Brain. We can make that happen.
What happens in our brains when we read a novel? Here's a picture of our brain. What's going on here? Why is there an eyeball? Let's find out. You see, the brain in this picture is taking in information from this eyeball. Visual information that is getting chopped up and processed through these different systems into understandable text. Wow. This picture. Human beings can recognize all the shapes in this picture as letters, even though they can be all wonky and wild. Word box learns what words typically look like, and it starts to follow rules that go along with a given language, like the example of reading from left to right. The word box is a region in the brain that develops as we learn to read, and it gets trained to recognize shapes that look like words. It recognizes letters and shapes precisely as they appear and in which sequence they happen to occur with other letters. Your word box will be most active when you look at words written in letters from the language you are most used to. However, across different cultures and languages, the word box develops in the same part of the brain. In fact, even people who are born blind and learn how to read by touch have a word box that is in the same part of the brain as in seeing people. Wow!
So here's something that I did not know. Was that no matter what language you learn to read in, even if you were born blind and only learned to read in Braille, you are still using the same parts of the brain. So when the scientists, they did like a lot of the brain scans, they found that like the left and right, the object cortex and the shape cortex, that they activate. And so it's sort of, they consider it like the word box in your brain. And so there's actually several different things that are going on in your brain at the same time while you're reading. And so it's sort of engaging like several different areas in your brain all at once. It's not just sort of like, okay, here's one little piece of my brain that goes active when I read. Like, no, it's actually like an experience like when you go skydiving or something. There's a lot of activity going on in your brain. And the same thing happens when you read. It's almost like you are doing that activity that the protagonist is referring to. Essentially, your brain thinks it's you doing. When we read, both the visual system and the language regions are involved. The visual system examines what the words look like, and the language regions tell us what they mean. So, essentially, there is several different parts of the brain that work together in order to make words make sense in our brain.
So this article is really long, but pretty interesting. It's about how blind folks were tested, specifically for this, the task-specific plasticity for reading, essentially meaning that they did not need to visually see the words in order to become familiar with words. And they sort of showed like the difference between like, before they did their studies and then what was activating afterwards. Neuroscience has long attempted to determine how cortical selectivity develops and how much it can be attributed to nature versus nurture, a question which the late Professor Benton devoted much work to. And then if we keep going, it says, our findings suggest that the same reading network active through vision is still recruited when reading through other senses such as audition, both early visual areas and higher order ones. Science of reading is unknown in most parts of the world and worse applied. The reasons are obvious. Most models of teaching and learning and of science in general are linear, mechanistic functionalist, reducing phenomena to limited or reductionist mechanisms. For example, cells, molecules, and behavioral models of living things. When the dynamic systems approach considers the world from links or connections and integration. In other words, everything is systemic and its specific structures result from the relationships between the parts or subsystems. In this context, reading is a complex system whose axis is the brain, which is the central management center that also acts as the memory center. The human being has approximately 12 to 15 billion nerve cells or neurons. Each neuron, in turn, can build millions of connections, which are formed when the brain is used. Thus, when they are more stimulated, more connections are built and the human being's capacity to think increases. Reading is thinking in action. Let's take a look at Mr. Brain again. When he's reading, he doesn't just use one little part of the brain. He uses a whole bunch of different systems in his brain at once to recognize the language, the shape of the words, and what those words mean.